The beginning of truth. Do you know what happens when two souls meet at the perfect wrong time? Do you know how silence can reveal more than words ever could do? You know that sometimes friendship becomes the safest form of love. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the dim light of the studio, the air filled with the soft hum of recording equipment. Joe Rogan adjusted his headphones, looking at him with that curious mix of respect and anticipation. Beside Keanu, Sandra Bullock smiled faintly, her hands resting on her lap, her energy calm but warm. It was the first time they had agreed to sit together for a long conversation, and everyone in the room felt something powerful was about to unfold. Joe leaned forward and asked, "You two share something that people can't quite define. What is it, really?" Sandra looked at Keanu and laughed softly. "We've been asking ourselves that for years." There was a pause that felt longer than a breath. Keanu didn't answer immediately. His eyes dropped for a moment, as if searching for the right words beneath 1,000 memories. When he finally spoke, his voice carried both stillness and weight. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "you meet someone who changes your rhythm without trying to." "That's what Sandra did for me." Sandra turned toward him, surprised by the raw honesty in his tone. Joe smiled knowingly and said, "Sounds like there's a lot more behind that sentence." And there was. Their story began long before fame had turned their names into symbols. Back then, they were just two actors on the set of a movie that none of them knew would become iconic. The days were long, the pressure was intense, and both of them were carrying private storms behind their calm faces. Sandra was still trying to prove that she could do more than comedy. People saw her as charming, but she wanted to be understood as strong. Keanu, on the other hand, had just lost someone close, though few knew it. He was learning how to exist again without breaking. They didn't talk much at first, but every silent glance between scenes seemed to say what words could not. On one cold morning during a break, Sandra brought him coffee without asking what he liked. She simply handed it over and said, "You look like someone who needs warmth." He smiled, that quiet kind of smile that felt like peace in motion, and replied, "You read people well." It was a small moment, but it became the foundation of something much deeper, a connection built not on attraction, but on understanding. They started having lunch together, sitting away from the noise of the set. Sometimes they talked about books, sometimes about nothing at all. "You always look like you're carrying the weight of the world," Sandra said once. Keanu shrugged. "Maybe I just don't know how to put it down." "Then let me carry a little of it," she said. He didn't respond. But that night, when he went home, her words kept echoing in his mind. As the podcast continued, Joe asked, "Did you ever realize how special it was back then?" Sandra took a deep breath. "Not really," she said. "When you're young, you don't always understand what you're feeling. You just know that some people make life feel lighter." Keanu nodded. "She reminded me that kindness doesn't need a reason. It just exists, and that changed me." The audience listening couldn't see it, but in that moment, the room felt sacred. Two souls, seasoned by years of pain, laughter, and lessons, were finally speaking about what they had silently carried for decades. Joe leaned back and said, "You know, not many people talk about this kind of bond anymore." "It's rare," Keanu smiled faintly. "Rare, but real." Then Sandra added something unexpected. "There was a time," she said softly, "when we almost lost that bond." Joe raised his eyebrows. "What happened?" She hesitated for a long time. Even Keanu looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure she would bring it up. "It was after the movie ended," she continued. "We promised to stay in touch. But life got busy, and sometimes you let silence grow where words should be." Keanu's eyes softened. "I remember that year," he said quietly. Sandra turned to him. "You disappeared, Keanu. You didn't return my calls. And I thought I had done something wrong." He looked down. "It wasn't you. I was going through something I didn't know how to explain." The room fell silent again. Joe didn't interrupt. He could sense that this was no longer an interview. It was a confession unfolding. "I lost someone that year," Keanu finally said, "and I didn't want anyone to see me broken. I thought silence would protect everyone around me." Sandra's eyes glistened. You didn't have to protect me. I just wanted to be there. Keanu looked at her, and in that gaze, years of unspoken emotion came rushing back. Regret, gratitude, and something even deeper. Something that neither of them had dared to name. Sometimes, he said, you don't realize how much someone cares until you lose the chance to tell them. Sandra smiled gently. You didn't lose it, Keanu. You're saying it now. Joe nodded slowly. That's powerful. It's rare to see people speak like this with such honesty. As the recording continued, they both shared stories and about laughter on set, quiet dinners, handwritten notes left in trailers, and the unspoken rule that whenever one of them was hurting, the other somehow knew without words. Keanu said, We had this strange connection. She could tell when something was off, even if I tried to hide it. You weren't very good at hiding it, Sandra teased. Your silence was louder than most people's words. Everyone in the studio laughed, but beneath the laughter was something beautiful. The recognition of two souls who had survived time without letting the world harden them. Toward the end of the episode, Joe asked, If you could go back and tell your younger selves one thing, what would it be? Sandra answered first. I'd tell her to stop overthinking every emotion. Some feelings don't need labels. Then Keanu said softly, I'd tell him to pick up the phone, because some silences last too long. The sound engineer gave the countdown to end the segment, but Joe gestured to keep recording. He knew something more was coming. Sandra turned toward Keanu and asked, Do you ever wonder what would have happened if timing had been different? Keanu looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were calm, but deep within them was a storm waiting to be spoken. Every single day, he said. The room went completely silent. The cameras kept rolling. Even Joe didn't move. That one sentence changed the atmosphere. It wasn't just nostalgia anymore. It was truth, unfiltered and raw, and as the first part of their conversation came to an end, the audience watching could feel it too, the sense that this was not just a story of friendship or missed chances. It was a story about love that never needed to be declared to be real. Sandra looked down, smiled faintly, and whispered, Then maybe this is the right time. But before Keanu could reply, the studio lights flickered, and the director's voice broke the silence. We need to reset the cameras, he said. The moment was gone, yet everyone in the room knew something had shifted forever. And the audience, millions of them, would keep wondering what Keanu wanted to say next. The silence between words. Do you know how silence can speak when words are too afraid to stay? Do you know how memories can follow you even when you run from them? Do you know that some emotions never fade? They only learn to wait the next morning as the world replayed clips from the podcast. Millions of people shared the same question. What did Keanu want to say before the cameras stopped? The internet was filled with moments from the interview, short edits of their glances, their smiles, the quiet comfort between them. But none of those viewers could truly feel what was happening inside them. After the recording ended, Keanu and Sandra stayed in the studio a little longer. The crew had left. Joe had gone to his next meeting, and only the sound of rain hitting the glass walls remained. Sandra sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Keanu stood near the window, his reflection faint in the dark glass. You never answered me, Sandra said softly. Keanu turned. About what? About whether this is the right time. He walked closer, his footsteps slow, deliberate. Maybe I'm still learning what right time means. Sandra gave a half smile, that kind of smile that hides both warmth and pain. You always were too careful with your heart. He nodded. And you were always brave with yours. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt familiar, like a language they both understood. It wasn't awkward. It was history breathing between them. Finally, Keanu said, When I said I think about timing every day, I meant it. There were moments I wanted to call you, to ask if you were okay, but I always stopped myself. I thought it would be selfish to bring the past into your present. Sandra's voice softened. You were never a selfish man, Keanu. Then maybe I was scared, he admitted. Scared that what I felt back then would come back too strong. and that I wouldn't know how to handle it. Sandra looked at him for a long time. Her eyes didn't show judgment, only understanding. You don't have to handle it. You just have to feel it, he smiled faintly. You make that sound easy. It's not, she said. But we've both learned how to carry harder things. She stood and walked toward the window beside him. The city lights below shimmered like small pieces of memory. She leaned against the glass, her reflection merging with his. Do you ever think, she asked quietly, that the world made us characters before it saw us as people? He nodded slowly. Maybe that's why we understood each other. We both learned to be real behind the curtain. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I never stopped caring, you know. He looked at her, his eyes heavy with the weight of years. I know, he said. That's why it was harder to stay away. The rain outside grew louder, soft but endless. It sounded like all the things they had never said. Sandra finally sat again, and Keanu joined her. The air felt calmer now, but also charged, like the moment before thunder. You know what's funny, she said. People think we're these calm, collected souls. But we're just two awkward humans trying to figure out what to do with feelings that never expired. Keanu chuckled quietly. Maybe that's why people connect to us. They see what we're too afraid to say. A small silence followed. Then Sandra asked, What would you have said if the cameras hadn't stopped? Keanu hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. I would have said that there was a time I thought you were the one person who saw me completely. And that maybe I didn't know how to live with that truth. Sandra's breath caught. That's a heavy thing to say. It's heavier to keep it inside, he replied. Her eyes softened again, and for the first time her voice trembled a little. So what now, Keanu? He looked up, his expression steady but unsure. I don't know. Maybe we just keep talking. Not as actors, not as memories, but as people. That's a start, she said. A few days later, they met again. Not in a studio, but at a quiet cafe near the ocean. Sandra had chosen the spot. She said the sound of waves helped her think. Keanu arrived early, as he always did. He sat facing the sea, lost in thought, until she appeared wearing a simple gray coat and a soft smile that carried decades of familiarity. You always choose the quietest corners, she teased. The noise makes me forget who I am, he said. The quiet reminds me. They talked for hours. Not about fame or movies, but about life, about mistakes, about what they learned while surviving it all. Sandra told him about her struggles with trust, about how fame made it hard to know who truly cared. Keanu shared stories about loss and how he found peace in solitude. At one point, Sandra said, You know, people always assume we had this secret romance. But the truth is, what we had was something stronger than that. Yeah, Keanu said. Something too deep to define. She smiled. Maybe that's why it lasted. Keanu looked at her, his voice quiet but honest. You were always my calm in the chaos. She blinked, her eyes glistening under the warm cafe light. And you were the reason I believed men could be gentle. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Outside, the ocean roared softly against the rocks. Inside, time felt slower, like the world had paused to listen. Then Sandra's phone buzzed. It was a message from her manager about an upcoming interview. She sighed, locked the screen, and said, You know, it's strange. I've done hundreds of interviews, but that one with Joe, it felt different. It felt like closure. Keanu looked at her thoughtfully. Or maybe it's the beginning of something else. Like what? Like finally saying everything we never could. Her eyes held his for a long moment. Then let's not stop. The following week, they agreed to meet again, this time at Keanu's home. It was small, peaceful, filled with books and quiet corners. She noticed the simplicity. No grand decor, just authenticity. She smiled and said, You've always lived like a monk. Discipline keeps me sane, he replied with a grin. They spent hours reminiscing, laughing at their old stories. But as night fell, something changed. Sandra found herself looking at him differently, not as the calm, mysterious man she once knew, but as someone fragile, open, and beautifully human, and Keanu, for the first time in years, let himself look back. You know, he said, there's something I never told you about that year we lost touch. What? She asked gently. I almost left Hollywood, he said. I couldn't handle the noise, the attention, the pretending. But one day I saw an interview of you. You were talking about kindness, and something you said kept me going. She frowned slightly. What did I say? You said, kindness is not a weakness, it's a quiet strength. It reminded me of you. It reminded me that being gentle in a hard world is its own kind of power. Her throat tightened. You never told me that. Some things take time, he said. Like this, she smiled faintly. So what now? Keanu looked outside where the moonlight was slipping through the window. Now, maybe we stop pretending we're done growing. Maybe this is where we start again. The room fell into soft silence. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, and inside, something real began to breathe again. Not love in the ordinary sense, but something deeper. Something rooted in years of shared silence, kindness, and unspoken truth. And as they sat together, the unrecorded moment became more honest than any interview ever could. But neither of them knew that the next conversation would change everything, because the world was still watching, and soon someone would twist their words, their silence, and their truth, turning something pure into a storm neither of them expected. When the world begins to listen, do you know how? Quickly, the world turns love into a headline. Do you know how truth becomes fragile when strangers begin to shape? Do you know that even honest hearts can be misunderstood 3 days after the podcast? Everything changed. The clips that were meant to inspire people began spreading across every platform. One short edit of Keanu saying, every single day, gained millions of views within hours. Another clip of Sandra whispering, maybe this is the right time, was replayed on talk shows, blogs, and fan channels all over the world. The internet did what it always does. It turned a private truth into public noise. Headlines screamed, Keanu and Sandra confess their hidden love on Joe Rogan's podcast. Reporters dug through old photos, interviews, and red carpet moments. They twisted gestures into stories, smiles into proofs. But behind the noise, both of them were quiet. Keanu stayed home, avoiding the flashing cameras parked outside his gate. Sandra, on the other hand, tried to laugh it off at first, but soon even she began to feel the weight of it. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her team told her to stay off social media. One night, she called Keanu. Have you seen what they're saying about us? She asked, her voice calm but trembling underneath. I've seen it, he said. They've taken everything out of context. It's like they don't care what we actually said. They never do. Keanu replied softly. They only hear what they want to feel. There was a pause. Sandra exhaled slowly. You okay? I will be, he said. But I'm worried about you. I'm fine, she said, though she didn't sound fine. It just hurts that something so honest turned into a circus. He smiled faintly on the other end of the line. Truth is fragile when everyone wants to own it. You always say things like that, she whispered. Like poetry that makes my heart ache. He didn't answer. Sometimes silence was safer than saying too much. That night, Sandra sat by her window looking at the city lights, remembering how peaceful it had been sitting beside him at the cafe, hearing the ocean instead of rumors. She wished people could understand that what they shared wasn't gossip. It was something sacred, born out of pain, respect, and time. Meanwhile, Joe Rogan's team called both of them, asking if they wanted to issue a joint statement to clear the air. Sandra said no. Keanu said no too. Let them think what they want, Keanu said during a call with Joe. We said what we needed to. I don't regret it. Joe respected that. You two said more truth in 2 hours than most people say in a lifetime, he said. But the storm didn't stop. One evening, as Keanu stepped out to get groceries, someone shouted, Are you and Sandra finally together? Another voice yelled, She deserves you, man! Cameras flashed. He kept walking, silent as always. That night, he got a message from Sandra. You don't have to protect me from this, you know, he replied after a few minutes. I'm not protecting you. I'm protecting the peace between us. Then let's protect it together, she wrote. The next morning, she showed up at his door. No makeup, no entourage, just her and a small box of muffins she baked herself. Figured you wouldn't have eaten, she said with a smile. He laughed softly. You still remember? Of course, she said, walking in. You never change your habits. They sat in the kitchen, the sunlight falling softly across the counter. For a while, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. They spoke about normal things, coffee, music, the quiet beauty of mornings. But then Sandra turned serious. Keanu, what if this changes everything? You mean our friendship? No, she said quietly. Us, he hesitated. Maybe it already has. She looked at him, her eyes steady. I've been thinking about what you said, that I saw you completely. I think I still do. He met her gaze. And that scares you? No, she whispered. It scares me that maybe I never stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It carried years of restraint, longing, and understanding. Keanu's eyes softened. He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers gently. You don't have to explain, he said. I understand. But before she could respond, his phone buzzed. It was his agent. Reluctantly, he answered. The call lasted less than a minute, but when he hung up, the peace in the room had shifted. What's wrong? Sandra asked. They want me to make a statement, he said. The studio thinks this could affect my upcoming project. They're afraid of rumors? She asked, her tone a little sharper now. They're afraid of distraction, he replied. And what do you think? He sighed. I think people forget that we're human. She stood and walked toward the window. So what will you do? He looked at her reflection in the glass. Nothing, he said. I won't turn something real into something for the headlines. She turned to face him. And if they threaten to replace you? Then they'll replace me, her heart sank. You fought so hard for peace, Keanu. Don't let them take it, he smiled faintly. Peace doesn't depend on them. The next morning, the tabloids published an article claiming Sandra had moved in with Keanu. They called it a secret rekindling. It was false, but the pictures, taken from afar, blurry and invasive, told another story. The headlines burned through the internet like wildfire. Both of their teams received calls. Brand contracts were suddenly under review. Everything that was once simple became complicated again. Later that week, Sandra's manager told her to distance herself from Keanu publicly, at least for a while. She sat quietly for a long time before responding. He's my friend. I won't pretend he's not. This isn't about friendship, Sandra. It's about reputation. Then maybe my reputation can survive honesty, she said, ending the call. That night, she called Keanu again. They told me to stay away from you, she said quietly. I figured they would, but I won't. Keanu smiled softly, though she couldn't see it. You don't have to fight for me, Sandra. I'm not fighting for you, she said. I'm fighting for what's real. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to the balcony, looking out at the stars that had always comforted him. Do you remember that night after our first premiere? He asked suddenly. Of course, she said. We sat on the rooftop eating pizza. You said something that stuck with me. What was it? You said we can survive anything if we stay kind. She smiled softly through the phone. I still believe that. Then maybe that's how we survive this too. Their conversation faded into the quiet of the night. But something deeper had begun forming beneath the noise. A resilience born not out of rebellion, but out of truth. Still, neither of them knew that the next week would test them in ways they hadn't faced before. Because sometimes the hardest test of love is not distance or time, it's the world's opinion. And soon, one interview, meant to defend their friendship, would lead to the most emotional confession of their lives. The storm behind kindness. Do you know how honesty feels when the world questions it? Do you know how it feels to defend something you can't even name? Do you know that silence can be louder than any declaration? The week that followed felt like an endless wave crashing against their peace. Every time Keanu opened his phone, there were new stories, new rumors, new lies wrapped in beautiful words. Sandra was facing the same storm. Their friendship, built on years of understanding and patience, had become everyone's favorite mystery. It started with an article. A journalist claimed to have exclusive insight into their so-called relationship, describing private details that never existed. It went viral. Soon, talk shows invited guests to discuss whether Keanu and Sandra were secretly in love all along. Even their fans, who once celebrated their humility, began demanding answers. Keanu stayed silent. He refused interviews, avoided events, and spent most of his days reading by the window, trying to remember what quiet used to sound like. Sandra, on the other hand, struggled to hold her calm. She wanted to speak up, but every word she said seemed to twist into another rumor. One morning, her publicist called. "They've requested you on late-night talk," she said. "They're promising to be respectful." Sandra hesitated. "Respectful doesn't mean honest." "I know," the publicist said, "but if you don't speak, they'll write their own truth." That night, she sat in her living room, staring at the flickering lights of Los Angeles outside. Finally, she sent a message to Keanu. "Should I do it? Should I talk?" He replied after a moment. "If you speak, speak your truth, not their version of it. Will you watch?" she asked. "Always." And so she agreed. The day of the interview, the studio was filled with cameras, makeup lights, and the kind of energy that hides tension beneath polite smiles. She wore a simple white dress, calm and composed. But inside, her heart raced. The host smiled warmly. "Sandra, people adore you and Keanu. They see the connection. They see the affection. Are you ready to tell us what's really happening between you two?" She paused for a moment, then smiled gently. "What's happening is friendship, respect, something that doesn't fit into labels." The host laughed lightly. "But surely there's more?" "More, yes," she said, her tone soft but steady. "But not the kind of more you can sell as a headline. We've been through pain, loss, laughter. He's family to me." "That's all?" The host nodded, sensing her firmness. "So you're saying the rumors are false?" "I'm saying," she replied slowly, "that truth doesn't need defending. It just needs peace." For a moment, the room was silent. Even the audience felt something real in her voice. That night, when the interview aired, people were moved. But the media wasn't done. The next morning, dozens of outlets twisted her words again. They quoted her saying, "There's more," but ignored the sentence that came after. Keanu saw it. His chest tightened as he read the headlines. "Sandra admits there's more to their story." Keanu's silence speaks volumes. He turned off his phone and stared at the sunlight creeping across his floor. He wanted to protect her, but he also knew she didn't need saving. She needed peace. Still, something inside him ached. That evening, he went for a long drive. He ended up near the coast, where waves hit the rocks like slow, steady heartbeats. He stood there for hours, watching the horizon, and then his phone buzzed. It was Sandra. "You saw it?" she asked. "I did." They twisted it again. "They always will," he said quietly. "So what do we do now?" He hesitated, then said, "Maybe we show them who we really are, not by words, but by how we live." She smiled faintly through the call. "That's very you, Keanu." "It's all I know how to be." A few days later, they appeared together, not for a show, not for a promotion, but at a small charity event for children's hospitals. They arrived separately, quietly, without publicists or announcements. They spent the evening talking to kids, signing gifts, and laughing in the simplest, most human way. A picture of them kneeling beside a child went viral overnight, not because of gossip, but because of the tenderness it carried. For the first time in weeks, people stopped arguing and started admiring. They saw what words couldn't describe, two souls radiating kindness in a world obsessed with noise. But peace never lasts long when the world smells profit. One reporter, who had followed them secretly, published a new story the next morning. It claimed to have insider footage of them holding hands backstage. The clip, blurry and grainy, spread fast. Millions watched it within hours. The truth was simple. Keanu had been helping Sandra walk down a dark hallway where cables were scattered on the floor. But no one wanted the truth. They wanted the fantasy. Sandra called him immediately. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I just wanted to do something good. And now this." "Don't let them turn your kindness into shame," he said. "That's what the world does when it doesn't understand love that's pure." "You always find the right words," she said quietly. "They're not right," he replied. They're just honest. Days turned into weeks. The chaos slowly began to fade, replaced by quiet respect from people who finally saw the truth behind their actions. But inside, both of them were changed. Fame had once been a bridge between them, but now it felt like a cage. One night, Sandra visited his home again. This time, she brought wine and silence. They sat on the porch, the night wind soft against their faces. "You ever wonder what would have happened if we weren't famous?" she asked. He smiled. "We'd probably still be sitting like this, just without the cameras," she laughed softly. "Maybe we'd have been braver." "Braver." "Yeah," she said. "To say things when they mattered." He looked at her for a long time. "Maybe it's not too late." She turned toward him. "And what would you say now if no one was watching?" He took a slow breath, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'd say that some people walk into your life once and stay forever, no matter where life takes you. I'd say that you taught me that love doesn't need a name or an ending. And I'd say that if I ever had to define peace, it would look a lot like sitting here with you." Her eyes glistened. "You can't just say things like that and expect me not to cry." He smiled gently. "Then cry. It means you're still real." For a long while, they just sat there, the night stretching endlessly around them. No rumors, no lights, no noise, just two people who had survived fame, heartbreak, and misunderstanding without losing their gentleness. But before the peace could settle completely, Sandra's phone buzzed again. It was a message from her assistant, urgent. "A journalist is claiming they have more footage from the podcast recording. They say it changes everything." She showed him the screen. He read it quietly, then looked up at her. "What footage?" she whispered. He didn't answer, but his expression shifted. Calm, yet shadowed by something deeper. "Keanu," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What did you say after they cut the recording?" He looked out at the stars, silent for a moment too long. "Something I never thought would be heard," he said. And just like that, the peace they had rebuilt began to tremble again, because sometimes truth is not what destroys you. It's the moment it finally gets revealed. What was never meant to be heard, do you know how truth waits in silence until the world is ready? Do you know how one unspoken sentence can change the course of hearts? Do you know that sometimes love survives only because it never gets declared? The morning the story broke felt colder than usual. Keanu woke up to dozens of missed calls and messages. His phone, usually quiet, wouldn't stop vibrating. The first message he opened was from his manager. "It's out. They released it. Check online." He sat still for a moment, his pulse heavy but calm. He already knew what it meant. He opened his laptop, clicked on a video link, and there it was, a leaked recording titled "The Hidden Part of Keanu and Sandra's Podcast Conversation." He pressed play. The clip started right after the moment the director had called cut. The studio lights were still flickering, the air heavy with everything left unsaid. In the leaked footage, Keanu looked at Sandra and said, quietly but clearly, "I think I fell in love with you the day you handed me that coffee on set." There was a soft gasp in the background. Sandra had looked at him, stunned, speechless. And then she smiled faintly, her eyes filled with something unspoken. The clip ended there, abruptly. The internet exploded. Within hours, it became the most shared video of the week. Fans wrote messages filled with admiration, others with speculation. Some called it the most beautiful confession ever. Others accused them of using emotion for attention. The noise returned, louder than ever. Keanu turned off his laptop and sat in silence. He didn't regret what he said, but he hadn't meant for the world to hear it. It wasn't meant for anyone except her. A few hours later, his phone rang. It was Sandra. "I saw it," she said softly. "I know. You really said that," she whispered. "I did," he said, "and I meant it." There was a long pause. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just breathed, slow and deep. "Why didn't you tell me back then?" "Because I didn't want to change what we had," he said. "You were my peace in a time when everything was chaos. I thought if I named it, I might lose it." "And now?" she asked. "Now I don't want to hide it anymore," he said quietly. "Not from you," her voice broke slightly. "The world's going to twist this again, Keanu. They already have, he said. But that doesn't make it less true. She didn't know what to say. Her mind was a storm, memories of years together, laughter, moments on set, small things that suddenly meant more than she had realized. Later that evening, she drove to his home again. No cameras followed this time. She wore no makeup, no disguise. She just came as herself, the woman who had spent decades understanding him and yet maybe never fully knowing the depth of his silence. He opened the door. She didn't speak. She simply looked at him, and in that silence, every unspoken emotion found its place. "You're not angry?" he asked. "Angry?" she whispered. "No, just overwhelmed." "Me too," he said. They sat together in his living room, the same one where they had once shared laughter and wine. Now there was only stillness between them, not awkward but fragile. "You know," she said after a long pause, "when I saw the clip, my first thought wasn't shock. It was relief. Because deep down, I think I always knew." "Then why didn't you say anything?" he asked gently. "For the same reason you didn't," she said. "We were afraid to ruin something beautiful." He nodded slowly. And maybe that's why it lasted. They both smiled faintly. Outside, rain began to fall again. Soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Keanu looked out the window, then turned back to her. "You know what's strange?" he said. "The world's been chasing stories about us for years. But the truth was always the simplest thing. That we loved each other quietly," she said. He nodded. "And maybe that's the only kind of love that survives this world." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain kept falling, the clock ticked softly, and the air around them felt sacred, not romantic in the shallow sense, but deeply human. Finally, Sandra stood. "What happens now, Keanu?" "Nothing," he said softly. "We keep being who we've always been, kind to the world and honest with each other." "You think the world will let that happen?" "They don't have to," he said. "Peace isn't something they can take. It's something we choose," she smiled, her eyes glistening. "You always make everything sound simple." "Because it is," he said. "We just make it complicated." As she turned to leave, he walked her to the door. She hesitated for a moment, then looked back at him. "You know," she said softly, "if you had said those words years ago, I probably would have said them back." His heart skipped. "And now?" She smiled gently. "Now I don't need to. You already know." She walked out into the rain. Keanu stood at the doorway, watching her until she disappeared into the distance. Later that night, he received a message from Joe Rogan. "You want to come back on the show? People are asking for a follow-up." Keanu smiled faintly at the screen. "Maybe someday," he typed, "but not now." Then, almost as if the universe wanted to keep testing him, another video surfaced. A longer version of the leaked recording. This time, it included what Sandra had whispered back after his confession. She had said almost too quietly to hear, and I think a part of me fell too. The world erupted again. Hashtags, articles, endless commentary. But Keanu didn't open his phone. He sat by the window, calm, his heart both heavy and light. He finally understood something that had taken him years to realize. Love doesn't always need an ending or a label. Sometimes it lives in the space between two souls who simply understand each other. And even though the world tried to claim their story, it was still theirs, untouched, real. But something deeper was still coming. Because truth once spoken has a way of pulling every hidden emotion into the light. And in the next days, Sandra would face a choice that would decide how their story truly ends, whether she would keep their love private forever, or finally tell the world what Keanu meant to her. The love that didn't need a name. Do you know that some stories don't end? They just find peace. Do you know that love can exist without promises? Without forever, do you know that sometimes the most beautiful endings are quiet? The next morning, Sandra woke up to a flood of messages. The longer version of the podcast clip was everywhere. Millions of people had heard her whisper, the one sentence she never thought anyone else would hear. And I think a part of me fell too. The world froze on those words. News anchors replayed them. Social media turned them into quotes, and fan pages flooded with comments like, "They finally confessed, and after all these years." But for Sandra, it wasn't about confession or drama. It was about truth. It was about finally letting something honest breathe after years of silence. She sat by her kitchen table, the morning sun washing over her face, and thought about everything. The years of friendship, the laughter, the loss, the moments between filming, the glances that lasted longer than they should have. She picked up her phone and saw a message from Keanu. "Don't let the noise steal what's real." "We're okay," she smiled faintly. "We are," she replied. Still, she knew there was one more thing she needed to do. Not for the world, not even for him, but for herself. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a film festival about authenticity in art. At first, she wanted to decline, but something inside her whispered that maybe this was the moment to finally close the circle. Not with a secret, but with truth spoken calmly, beautifully, and on her own terms. On the day of the event, the hall was full, the air buzzed with expectation. Reporters, fans, and peers waited quietly as she stepped onto the stage. She wore a simple black outfit, elegant but unpretentious, and her eyes carried a quiet strength that only comes from surviving storms. She stood before the microphone and smiled. "People often ask me what authenticity means," she began. "For me, it means telling the truth, even when it trembles." The crowd listened intently. "You all know there's been a lot of talk about Keanu and me," she said, her voice steady but soft. "And maybe in a way that's fair. Because when two people share something real, it shows, even if they never try to show it." She paused, her eyes glistening. "We met decades ago. We were young, unsure, trying to figure out who we were in a world that doesn't always allow kindness. And through it all, he was my safe place. No drama, no expectations, just quiet understanding." The audience was completely silent. "And yes," she continued, her smile gentle, "there was love there. Not the kind you read about in tabloids, not the kind that needs to be claimed or proven. It was love that grew quietly in respect, in laughter, in the kind of friendship that never breaks. It was love that didn't need to own anything." Her voice softened even more. "And maybe that's why it lasted." She looked down for a moment, then back up at the audience. "If the world learned anything from this story, I hope it's this. Kindness is stronger than rumors. Gentleness doesn't mean weakness. And love doesn't have to be loud to be real." When she finished, the room stood in silence for several seconds before applause filled the hall. But it wasn't the kind of applause that comes from excitement. It was soft, emotional, like gratitude made sound. Keanu, watching from home, smiled quietly. He didn't post anything, didn't make a statement. He just watched her speak, feeling a deep peace settle over him. Later that night, he called her. "You did good," he said. "I didn't plan to say it all," she admitted, "but it just came out." "It was perfect," he said. "So," she asked softly, "what happens now?" "Nothing," he said. "We keep living. We keep being us." "And the world? They'll move on," he said. "They always do. But we'll still have this." She smiled through the phone. "You know, I used to think our story would end one day, but maybe it doesn't have to." "It doesn't," he said, "because it's not about ending. It's about remembering." A long silence followed, the kind that wasn't empty but full of peace. After the call, Keanu walked outside. The city was quiet, and the night sky stretched endlessly above him. He looked up, thinking about all the moments that had led them here. The coffee on set, the laughter between scenes, the rain, the silence, the podcast, the storm. He realized that every one of those moments had built something unshakable, a love that had evolved into grace. The next morning, a charity foundation announced a new project in both their names, a scholarship fund for young filmmakers focused on compassion-driven storytelling. They hadn't planned it together, but both had donated quietly, unaware of the other's contribution. When they found out, they just laughed. "Of course you did," Sandra texted. "We're still on the same page," Keanu replied. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. The noise disappeared. And what remained was something purer, a quiet understanding that some bonds aren't meant to fit into words. Months later, during an interview for another film, Keanu was asked a simple question. "After all these years, what does love mean to you?" He thought for a moment, then said softly, "It means choosing kindness, even when the world isn't watching. It means remembering the people who made you better, even if they're no longer by your side every day. And it means peace, the kind that doesn't demand anything back." The interviewer smiled. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Keanu said, "but it's worth it." That night he received a message from Sandra, heard the interview. "Proud of you," he smiled, typed back, "Same to you." And then, as he put his phone down, he whispered something to himself, a quiet truth that didn't need anyone to hear it. "Thank you for finding me when I didn't know who I was." The camera never captured that moment. No headline ever wrote about it. But maybe that was the point, because real love, the kind built on trust, respect, and quiet strength, doesn't live in interviews or podcasts. It lives in silence, in presence, in peace, and as the world kept moving, their story stayed where it belonged, in the space between two souls who once met, understood, and never stopped caring.